Right then, here we are once again inside the wonderful world of War Thunder, where today we'll be taking a little look at nobody's favourite reserve tank, the Char Leger Model 1935 H, more commonly referred to as the Hotchkiss H-35. Now, as I'm sure everyone knows by now, I'll be covering the historical and technical details first, which means that if you're tearing up your seat with impatience, waiting for this beast to be put up against its rivals in the fiery crucible of combat, then wait no longer. I have graciously placed a time code in the video description that'll transport you through time and space to France in 1940, where you can experience this mighty machine firsthand. For those of us with a more sober-minded disposition, let's put on our asbestos gloves, drape copious amounts of garlic around our necks, fill up the tank with cheese and baguettes, and open up a bottle of wine as we prepare to embark on the adventure that is the history of the Hotchkiss H-35. Now, as with a lot of these early vehicles, we must start by going to the First World War and the dawn of French tank development. Like Great Britain, France was eager to break the stalemate of trench combat by any means necessary and, like the British, came up with the idea of fitting an armoured box with caterpillar tracks, enabling it to cross the muddy, shell-cratered, trench-strewn, barbed wire-infested terrain of no man's land, while remaining impervious to Axis machine gun bullets, allowing it to engage infantry and emplacements with cannon and machine gun fire, opening a hole in the enemy's lines through which the cavalry and infantry could advance. However, the way these two countries set about creating such machines was very different. While Britain established the so-called Landships Committee, which would experiment with and trial a new design until they were satisfied it would work at the front before handing over the design to the manufacturers, France relied on the manufacturers to produce their own competing designs, meaning that collaboration on ideas and trial results was virtually non-existent. As a result, France's first tank, the Schneider CA-1, despite being ready only a few months after the first tank in history, the British tank Mark I, was comparably ill-equipped to deal with the conditions at the front. While the tank Mark I was an extensively tested system of specially designed track shoes running around a large rhomboidal hull designed to maximise trench crossing capability, the Schneider CA-1 was essentially just an armoured box stuck onto a slightly modified Holt tractor. As a result, despite the addition of a boat-shaped hull front and a small tail sabot, the CA-1 did not perform well off-road, and trench crossing capability was severely limited. They were powered by a single 75 horsepower Holt petrol engine, and armament consisted of a single 75mm Schneider blockhouse gun, mounted in a limited traverse mount in a barbette on the right-hand side of the vehicle, and two 8mm Hotchkiss M1914 machine guns, mounted in ball mounts, one on each side. On the 16th of April 1917, 128 Schneider CA-1s were deployed at Berry-au-Bas for the Nivelle offensive. However, on the day of the attack, 44 tanks failed to make it to the start line, having broken down on the way from the staging area. Things only got worse from there. The plan was for French infantry to take the first two lines of German trenches, advancing behind a rolling barrage, whereupon the tanks would assault the third trench line, which, upon breaking, would allow the infantry and tanks to spill through into the Germans' rear area. In practice, however, the French artillery barrage was inadequate due to a shortage of artillery pieces, and the German artillery was left relatively unscathed. The infantry suffered catastrophic losses taking even the first line of trenches, meaning that the Schneiders had to be deployed early in order to assist taking the second. However, despite the area having been especially chosen for the use of tanks due to its relatively firm ground, the cross-country performance of the Schneider CA-1 was so dire that many ditched themselves or broke down struggling across the terrain, which overstrained their underpowered engines. The German infantry, having been instructed on tactics to deal with tanks following Britain's first tank assault 7 months earlier, did not panic, and concentrated on dealing with the French infantry, leaving their artillery pieces to engage the tanks. Moreover, due to German air superiority at the time, reconnaissance flights had spotted the accumulation of tanks behind the French lines, and so emplaced several artillery pieces forward among the German infantry lines to fire directly at the tanks when they came. As a result, even though some Schneiders managed to reach the 3rd German trench line, the French infantry could not follow, and the Schneiders were steadily picked off by the artillery and German soldiers aiming for the exposed fuel cans on the tanks' rears, before retreating that evening. In all, 76 of the 128 tanks had been destroyed, almost 60%. As a result of this disastrous first outing, many Schneider CA-1 tanks were converted into armoured supply vehicles and artillery tractors, although a few of the remaining gun tanks were useful in halting the German spring offensive in 1918. In direct competition with Schneider was the Forges et Aciéries de la Marine et de Homme Corps, or FAMH, which was based at Saint-Chamond in Loire. The French government ordered the company to build 400 tanks, and so, in order to make things easier logistics-wise for the army, FAMH decided to build a vehicle similar to the Schneider CA-1 using interchangeable components. Schneider, however, did not allow FAMH to use their patented parts, such as the sabot tail skid, without a notable fee, and so FAMH said screw that, and designed their own tank instead. The new tank, named the Char Saint-Chamond, was designed to be bigger and better than the Schneider CA-1 in almost every way. The Holt tractor suspension used was lengthened by a 3rd bogie. However, in order to fit the main armament chosen for the tank, the Canon D75mm TR Saint-Chamond, model 1915, a modified version of the famous Canon D75 model 1897, a substantial overhang was required at the front of the vehicle. The Char Saint-Chamond was powered by an innovative petrol-electric drive, whereby electricity generated by a 90 horsepower 4-cylinder Panhard Levasseur engine was fed into 2 Crochet Collider electric motors, one for each track. The result was a 23 metric ton tank that was very easy to drive, provided it was on flat ground. However, the new system did not come without its problems. It was underpowered and prone to breaking down, and required a secondary driver in the rear of the tank in order to operate. In addition to the 75mm main armament, which was the most powerful gun mounted on any tank until 1941 incidentally, the Char Saint-Chamond sported 4 8mm Hotchkiss M1914 machine guns, one in the front, one in the back, and one on each side. As the design could not utilize the Schneider-designed tail skid arrangement, obstacle crossing capability was achieved by use of 3 wooden rollers underneath the hull, 2 at the front and 1 in the back. The Char Saint-Chamond was first used on the 5th of May 1917 at Lafaux Mill, where 16 vehicles were deployed against German trenches. Only 3 tanks even made it to their objectives, the rest getting stuck. This was due to the weak power plant, the short tracks, and the substantial overhangs both at the front and rear of the vehicle. The Saint-Chamond crews complained loudly, leading the French High Command to withdraw them from frontline service. However, in 1918, with the war becoming more mobile and the muddy terrain of trench warfare being left behind, the Char Saint-Chamond was redeployed, operating now as a heavy assault gun, a role in which this tank excelled. However, the most important French tank of the war, and indeed possibly the most influential tank in history, the basic layout of which is still used in main battle tanks today, was of course the legendary Renault FT. The Société des Automobiles Renault, a car company founded in 1899, was approached on the 21st of December 1915 by Colonel J.B.E. Estienne, with the request that they build a vehicle he had designed. Renault declined, and Estienne went instead to Schneider, where his design became the Schneider CA-1. Renault, meanwhile, was not sitting around twiddling its collective thumbs. Louis Renault was in fact paying close attention to tank development, and began working on a new design almost as soon as Colonel Estienne had left the Renault factory. Renault approached the task of building a new tank a little more thoughtfully than Schneider or FAMH. Instead of getting a stripped-down Holt tractor and slapping an armoured box on top with a few guns poking out, his design was to be built from scratch. Renault realised early on that the engines available at the time were all a bit crap, and decided that the tank must not exceed 7 tons if it was to have sufficient mobility for the battlefields of 1917. The engine also had to be fed via a fuel pump to avoid it losing power on steep inclines, as was the case with gravity-fed engines. Rodolph Ernst Metzmeier, Renault's chief industrial designer, designed the tank to be as small as possible. Almost every square inch of the internal volume was taken up by equipment or machinery. The engine chosen was a 39 horsepower Renault 4-cylinder petrol unit located in the rear of the vehicle in its own separate compartment, divided from the crew compartment by a firewall. Not only did this improve conditions for the crew compared to other tanks at the time by reducing noise, heat and poisonous fumes, if the engine caught fire then the crew had a reasonable chance of not being incinerated along with it. Ventilation fans drew cool air through the crew compartment to the engine, which further improved crew comfort. The driver sat at the front between the 2 large wooden idler wheels, which were raised to improve the tank's parapet climbing capability. The tracks were tensioned by a spring-mounted return roller, which ensured that the tracks did not slip off the tank's running gear. At the rear of the tank, ignoring Schneider's idiotic patents, was a large tail skid, which greatly improved the vehicle's trench-crossing capability. In the middle of the tank, behind the driver, stood the commander/gunner, who operated the vehicle's armament, either an 8mm Hotchkiss machine gun or a 37mm Puteaux gun, which was mounted in a fully traversable turret. This basic layout of having the driver at the front, the engine in the back, and the main armament in a traversable turret in the middle is the configuration for tanks almost universally used by every battle tank since, from the Renault FT to today's M1 Abrams or T90 main battle tanks. One more huge advantage that the Renault FT had over the Schneider CA1 and the Char Saint-Chamond was its cost. For the price of a single Saint-Chamond, 6 Renault FTs could be built. Seeing the superiority that the FT had over its competitors, the French government ordered 3,530 examples. However, by the end of 1917, only 84 tanks had been delivered. The main production bottleneck was the cast turret, into which it was very difficult to fit the 37mm Puteaux gun. Berliet, another company bought in to assist Renault in producing FTs, solved this problem by producing a new, larger, hexagonal turret of riveted construction, into which the Puteaux fit easily. By the armistice on the 11th of November 19, the order for 3,530 vehicles had been fulfilled, 1,850 being built by Renault, 800 by Berliet, 600 by Saumur, and 280 by Delaunay-Belleville. And because Louis Renault was a jolly stand-up fellow, he didn't even charge royalties. Take that, Schneider. In addition to the 3,530 Renault tanks built by France during the First World War, the United States, who prior to April 1917, when they joined in with the fighting, had produced no tanks at all, endeavoured to license produce the Renault FT as the Tank M1917 to equip its expeditionary force. However, because by June the next year the United States still had not delivered any M1917s, France decided to lend the American troops 144 Renault FTs. Towards the end of the war, Renault FTs, often accompanied by the older Schneiders and Saint-Chamonds, performed very successfully against the Germans using massed swarm attacks to overwhelm Axis positions. After the war, the French army continued to operate the Renault FT and would do so until 1940, where they were seized by the Nazis. Louis Renault, being a competent businessman, wasted no time after the war in setting up export orders for the Renault FT. By the way, FT stands for nothing. It's a production code that came before FU and after FS. The newly liberated nation of Poland purchased 23 examples, which were used during the Soviet-Polish War of 1920. Following their success in that conflict, the Poles bought another 174 tanks, as well as building a further 26 using spare parts. A few Polish Renault FTs, exact numbers are sketchy, around 40 to 50, were sold to Uruguay, who in turn sold them to the Spanish Republicans. Yugoslavia and China also bought a few Renault FTs from Poland. 3 Renault FTs had been bought by Italy in June 1918, with the intention of establishing licensed production. However, these plans did not come to fruition before the armistice. Fiat decided to alter the design by shortening and widening the hull. The suspension was modified and covered by an armoured skirt, into which were depressed mud chutes. The Renault engine was replaced by a 50 horsepower Fiat SPA 4-cylinder air-cooled petrol engine, which almost tripled the vehicle's top speed from 4 miles per hour or 6 kilometers per hour to 11 miles per hour or 18 kilometers per hour. Finally, a larger, taller turret was installed, sporting a pair of 6.5mm Breda machine guns. By the time it was put into production in 1921, the Fiat 3000 model 1921, also known as the Carro de Assalto L5/21, was quite different from its predecessor. But further information of the Fiat 3000 and its derivatives will have to wait until Gaijin decides to add Italian tanks to War Thunder, so I can make videos about them. In the meantime, it's back to the Renault FT. Spain bought 12 machine-gun-armed Renault FTs in 1921, which were used in Morocco during the Rif War against the Beni Said tribe. During the Spanish Civil War, Renault FTs were used by both sides. The FT, as well as a single Fiat 3000 bought in 1925, significantly influenced the design of Spain's first tank design, the Carro de Combat Trubia, a few of which were built by the Spanish Republicans during the Civil War, although the Nationalists managed to capture 2 of the prototypes. Between 15 and 30 Trubias were built, plus 4 prototypes, however their combat record is unknown. The White Russians bought a number of Renault FTs in 1920 for use against Poland and also to fight the Red Army. Many were captured by the Soviets, who copied the design for the first Soviet tank, the so-called Russian Renault. This vehicle heavily influenced the Soviet Union's first natively designed tank, the T-18, more details of which are available in the T-26 video, which will be linked to in the description below. Sweden purchased a single Peugeot-armed Renault FT in 1923, but they were not impressed by its performance, and so converted it into a radio tank. Finland received 34 Renault FTs in 1919 and 1920, most of which were armed with 37mm guns. These saw service during the 1939 Winter War as training tanks or static pillboxes. The training tanks were still in service in 1943. Yugoslavia acquired some 34 Renault FTs from a few different sources during the early 20s, as well as a few Renault NC2s, which we'll be discussing later. These were deployed against the invading Germans in 1941. Brazil purchased 12 Renault FTs, 4 machine gun variants, 7 Peugeot armed tanks, and a single TSF command tank in 1921. These were used by the Brazilian government against the revolution for Brazilian independence from Portugal in 1932. Belgium was sold 75 Peugeot-armed Renault FTs and promptly set about improving the design by modifying the engine to increase power output, as well as adding thicker armour. The Belgians called their tanks Renault FT-18s. These saw action during the German invasion of 1940. Greece tested a few Renault FTs but ordered none. Turkey bought a few for use as training tanks in 1916. Romania bought 72 new Renault FTs in 1919 to supplement the few they had received from France during the First World War. These were used in response to the growing threat of communism from the Soviet Union. These were relegated to training roles in 1939. China used the Renault FTs they had acquired from Poland against the warlords Chang So-lin and Wu Peifu. Later, they were deployed during the border skirmishes with the Soviet Union. However, when Japan invaded from Manchuria, most were captured. These were then transferred to the army of Manchukuo. Japan, as those of you who have watched the Type 95 Hargo video will know, bought a single Renault FT along with 12 medium tank Mark A Whippets in 1919. This vehicle was known as the Type 79 Kogata and used for training. In addition to the basic Renault FT, which is often referred to as the FT-17, there were a few variants built. The first of these was the Renault TSF, built early in 1918, which was an unarmed command tank fitted with radio equipment. 188 of these were built. Another significant modification was the Renault FT-75BS. This was essentially a self-propelled gun sporting a 75mm Blockhaus Schneider howitzer in a fixed turret. 40 examples were built after the end of the war. These were still in service in 1940. In 1925, 42 Renault FTs were modified using the Congress suspension system, which utilised rubber tracks. These saw some service during the Rif War, but it was soon found that the rubber tracks would often snap in the desert conditions. Afterwards, a few of these were sold to Poland and Yugoslavia, some of which may eventually have ended up in China. Following the Renault FT Congress, Renault set about designing two new suspension systems for the Renault FT. The first of these was the Renault NC1, which was built using a lengthened FT hull, to which was fitted a suspension system made of large vertical volute springs. The result was a tank that could reach 18 km per hour, or 11 miles per hour on the road. However, the French military did not order the Renault NC1 until significant modifications had been applied, to such an extent that the finished tank was almost a completely new design, now called the Renault D1. We'll discuss that in a moment. The original Renault NC1 was sold widely to countries that had already purchased Renault FTs, such as Poland and Yugoslavia. The most significant recipient of the NC1, however, as some of you may remember from the Hargo video, was Japan, where it was called the Otsugata Sensha. For more information regarding the Otsugata Sensha, please refer to the Hargo video. The Renault NC2 reverted to the Congress rubber track system, however, this time with some improvements. The reason for this was that the NC1 suspension was deemed too complicated and costly to maintain. The rubber tracks were reinforced with steel shoes, which reduced the likelihood of them snapping at high speeds. The Renault NC3, later called NC31 and referred to by the Army as the Shah D1, was much larger than the NC1 from which it was derived. It featured an enlarged version of the NC1 suspension with large vertical volute springs, as well as a new turret designed by Schneider, which featured a 47mm SA-34 gun and a coaxial 7.5mm Rifle machine gun. Another Rifle machine gun was located in the hull front, fixed in place and operated by the driver. Next to the driver sat the radio operator, leaving the commander/gunner/loader all alone in the turret by himself. On delivery in 1934, the Renault D1 was a disaster. Engines were already worn out due to shoddy components, and armour plates were bent and poorly put together. Despite efforts to improve the D1s, the tank remained woefully unreliable. Because of this, the French government dumped the lot on the French colony of Tunisia. When the Germans attacked in May 1940, France called back as many Renault D1s as were serviceable, which was 43 examples. These saw a little success against the German tanks, their thick armour of 40mm proving effective against the Germans' 37mm anti-tank guns. However, the Germans soon learned to flank round to the sides of the D1, and soon only 7 remained in France, all of which were captured and used by the Wehrmacht as the Panzerkampfwagen 732F, most likely for garrison duties. Back in North Africa, following the French capitulation, the Free French forces managed to hide 18 D1s, which later saw action in the Battle of Kasserine Pass. However, due to the tough desert conditions, the remaining Renault D1s were replaced with British Valentines and scrapped. While the D1 was under development, Renault drew up plans for a bigger, more powerful version, which would become the Renault D2, designed to compete with the Shah B1 bis. Armour and armament, as well as crew complement and internal layout, was essentially the same as that of the D1, although the tank itself was a little larger. Unfortunately, the D2 also retained the D1's poor build quality and unreliability. These entered service in 1935. In 1938 it was decided that the Renault D2 lacked anti-tank capability, and so the APX-1 turret with its SA-34 47mm gun was replaced with an APX-4 turret featuring a SA-35 47mm gun. This turret was very similar to the one fitted to the Saumur S-35. In action, the Renault D2 suffered heavily from mechanical unreliability and the chronic lack of spare parts, leading to many of the tanks being cannibalized for components. A few of these were sent to aid the French forces in Norway, but were quickly withdrawn after it was found that they could not adapt to the cold conditions. The D2s soldiered on, their number being steadily whittled down until by the time of France's surrender, only 7 tanks of the initial 84 remained operational. The Germans captured these 7, as well as 14 stuck in repair workshops, but didn't bother upfitting them, or refitting them, even for garrison duty. The turrets were removed for emplacement on Atlantic wall fortifications and armoured trains. And thus ends the long, long tale of the venerable Renault FT. Except it doesn't, because now we have to rewind a little bit back to 1931, where the French army, still operating some 1,850 Renault FTs, began a modernisation programme. This included removing the 8mm Hotchkiss of the machine gun version and replacing it with a 7.5mm Renault machine gun. This upgraded tank was called the Renault FT-31. The tanks armed with a 37mm Puteaux were left largely unchanged. Around 1,580 FT-31 conversions were made, most of which were still in service when Germany invaded. These were captured by the Germans and used mostly for garrison and training duties. In addition to these production variants of the Renault FT, a few prototypes were also built using this chassis, such as bridge layers, fascine carriers, bulldozers, snow blowers, mobile cranes, a version that carried a concrete block to obscure machine gun slits in pillboxes, a police floodlight carrier, a self-propelled gun armed with 105mm howitzer, tank destroyers, ammunition carriers, mine disposal vehicles, and even an agricultural tractor. None of these projects came to fruition, however. And now, finally, it is time to move on from the venerable Renault FT to the date of 1926, where the French army set about reorganizing the tank forces. France had no independent tank corps, the cavalry and infantry both fielding their own vehicles. The infantry came up with 3 different classes of tank based on role. The first was the Char Léger, or light tank class, which was to be armed with a 37mm gun and a coaxial machine gun. This class contained tanks such as the Renault R-35 and R-40, and the FCM-36, both of which shall be covered in later videos, and also the Hotchkiss H-35, which we'll be talking about today. All those little Renault FTs and FT-31s were also lumped into this category. But that'll come later, because first there's more stuff to cover about French tank doctrine. In addition to the Char Léger, there was also the Char de Bataille, or battle tank class, which called for a 47mm gun. This class contained only one tank type, the Char B series, which shall also be getting its own video. The Char de Bataille class was later supplemented by the Char Moyens, or medium tank category, which covered the Renault's D1 and D2, as well as the AMX-38, none of which we currently have in War Thunder. The final tank category in the infantry was the Char Lourd, or heavy tank class. Like the Char de Bataille, this category contained only one tank type, in this case the monstrous Char 2C, which incidentally would make a great premium low-tier heavy tank gaijin. The cavalry went about categorizing their tanks a little differently. Like with the United States and Imperial Japan at the time, Army doctrine stated that the cavalry was forbidden from operating tanks, and so, in order to get around this idiotic rule, the cavalry called their tanks armoured cars, or automitrailleuses. The first cavalry classification, Automitrailleur de Découvert, actually did contain armoured cars, such as the AMD-35, also known as the Panhard 178. These proved very popular with the Germans, who used them extensively for occupation duties. The next category, AMR, standing for Automitrailleur de Reconnaissance, included reconnaissance tanks such as the AMR-33 or Renault VM and the AMR-35 or Renault ZT, a few variants of which are present in the game. The next category was named Automitrailleur de Combat, which kind of speaks for itself. The AMC category included the AMC-34 or Renault YR and the AMC-35 or Renault ACG-1, both of which shall be getting their own videos. The fourth and final category was the Chars de Cavalerie, or cavalry tanks. This category was created in 1935 after the French government realized that prohibiting the cavalry from using tanks, especially when they could just call them tracked armoured cars, was ridiculous. And so the cavalry tank category was formed, and included such vehicles as the Hotchkiss H-35 and the Saumur S-35. The Société des Anciens Établissements Hotchkiss H-35 was founded in the United States by Benjamin B. Hotchkiss, a gunsmith in the mid-19th century. In 1867 he moved to France and began building weapons for the French military, specializing in artillery pieces, which were used during such conflicts as the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. At the turn of the 20th century, Hotchkiss expanded to other forms of weaponry, as well as civilian cars. Perhaps their most notable product of this period was the Hotchkiss AIM 1914 machine gun, which was the standard medium machine gun of the First World War for several nations, including France, who alone ordered 7,000 weapons. In 1933, following a rather grudging adoption of the Renault D1 by the French infantry, Hotchkiss began to design a tank that would fit the role of char d'accompagnement, while at the same time being lighter, cheaper and more capable. This was achieved through the extensive use of casting, the hull constituted of 6 cast-armoured sections bolted together, as well as the mass-produced APXR cast turret made by Puteaux Foundry. However, Hotchkiss wasn't the only company looking to provide a replacement for the D1. Renault managed to complete their bid, the Renault R-35, some time before the Hotchkiss was ready. This meant that, despite a change with the infantry's required specifications, Renault was granted the initial contract for 300 tanks. In September 1936, the first pre-production Hotchkiss H-35s were ready for delivery. However, the army decided to test its new tanks. It was a good thing they did, for the H-35 was found to perform very poorly off-road. They were badly balanced and very difficult to steer on anything other than smooth, flat terrain, which meant that the tank would have posed a serious risk to any accompanying infantry, which would have been somewhat less than ideal, seeing as how the tank was intended to be an infantry tank. However, the army could not simply reject the tank outright due to the rather strange political predicament France was in at the time, and so the Hotchkiss H-35 was instead dumped onto the cavalry. The cavalry, whose budget was very limited and whose only real alternative, the Saumur S-35, was very expensive, agreed, and so the Hotchkiss H-35 became a cavalry tank. As the cavalry doctrine was for them to use roads as much as possible, the H-35's poor off-road performance did not matter too much anyway. In my own personal opinion, the entire purpose of a tank is to go off-road. That's why it's got tracks. Otherwise you might as well use armoured cars. They're faster and easier to maintain. But I wasn't on the French commissioning board, so it doesn't matter, does it? When the Second World War started, the French cavalry fielded some 300 Hotchkiss H-35s, and the infantry still had 100, as well as 180 of the new Hotchkiss H-39, although that particular tank will be getting its own video. The infantry had received Hotchkiss tanks due to insufficient numbers of the Renault R-39 having been produced. The H-35s did not perform particularly notably during the Battle of France, being largely overshadowed by its more capable sibling, the Hotchkiss H-39. However, the H-35's armour was still sufficient to protect the tank from the Wehrmacht's 3.7cm anti-tank gun, much to the chagrin of German gun crews. Following France's surrender, many H-35s were captured by the Germans, who used them mostly for occupation duties in places like Yugoslavia, although some were kept in France for training and security operations. These were later pitted against the Allies during the D-Day landings. The Germans typically modified their captured French tanks, including their Hotchkiss H-35s, by removing the commander's rotating observation dome and replacing it with a proper cupola. In German service, the H-35 was called Panzerkampfwagen 35H-734F. In 1942, the Wehrmacht came up with a program to modify the large stock of captured French and British tanks that Germany still possessed, to make them into more effective fighting vehicles. This usually involved removing the turret and sticking a 7.5cm Pak-40 in place, which yielded a makeshift tank destroyer. The Hotchkiss H-35, it seems, however, missed becoming an overgrown gun emplacement, with the only modification that I could find being that of the Panzerkampfwagen 35HF mit 2.8/32cm Werfrahmen, whereby 4 large rockets were hung off the side of the tank in their wooden launch crates. And so ends the tale of the little Hotchkiss H-35. But fear not, dear listener, for this story continues with the much more exciting Hotchkiss H-39. In the meantime, however, it is time to take a little look at the Hotchkiss H-35 inside the wonderful world of War Thunder. Right then, so here we have the Charles Leclerc Model 1935H, or for those who prefer, the Hotchkiss H-35, here in the wonderful world of War Thunder. Look at it there, isn't it lovely? Anyways, in War Thunder, the Hotchkiss H-35 is a Rank 1 Battle Rating 1.0 reserve light tank. It has a crew of 2, the driver, who sits at the front, and the commander, who, in addition to telling the driver where to go, spots targets, loads the gun, fires the gun, operates the machine gun, and generally has a tough old time. To learn more about one-man turrets and why they're crap, why not check out this excellent video by the great Lindy Beige. The 10.6 tank is powered by a Hotchkiss 3.4-litre V6 air-cooled petrol engine producing 75 horsepower or 55.2 kilowatts, giving the tank a power-to-weight ratio of approximately 77.1 horsepower per tonne. This gives the vehicle a top speed of 28 km per hour or 17.4 miles per hour. On level ground, however, the vehicle will struggle to reach 25 km per hour or 15.5 miles per hour. From neutral, the tank can turn itself around in about 30 seconds, although in a higher gear this can be achieved in just 10. However, it can be a little tricky to get the tank to stay in a higher gear when turning, as it keeps wanting to change down into first. The gearbox is a synchro mesh unit with 5 forward gears and 1 reverse. In reverse, the tank can reach its maximum speed of 5 km per hour or 3.1 miles per hour with relatively little trouble. The armour is all cast, consisting of 6 cast homogeneous sections bolted together. The thickest armour is on the turret front at 45mm, although there is a large aperture to hold the binocular vision port, which itself is only 35mm thick. The turret also features a 25mm thick internal gun mantlet. The turret sides and rear are 40mm thick, but again there are gaps for the 35mm thick vision ports. The rear of the turret contains the commander's access hatch, which doubles up as a seat for him to sit on when he wants to look around. There's also a small pistol port in the hatch. The commander's cupola is a 40mm thick cast steel dome that can rotate, although not in game. He peeks out of the cupola by use of this stupid little letterbox flap thing. The spikes on the cupola are actually hooks to allow it to be lifted off by a crane. The turret also features 3 such hooks. The main armament consists of a single 37mm SA-18L/21 short-barrel gun mounted in the turret, which fires either MLE 1937 APCR shells or MLE 1892 APHE shells. I personally would recommend carrying about 15 APHE shells, set as your first option, and 15 APCR shells. The APHE shells can perforate 19mm of armour at 500 metres, which, let's face it, is crap. But if the shell does manage to get through, its 15 grams of TNT will do a little more damage than the solid APCR shell. The APCR shells in question can perforate 24mm of armour at 500 metres, which is still rubbish, but better than the 19mm of the MLE 1892. The reload rate, however, is 4 seconds, which is pretty crap for a gun of this size. You get 76 shells in total, but I, like with most tanks, would recommend carrying only 30. The gun is freely elevated, meaning that it is semi-stabilized by the commander. This means that when reversing, or coming to a sudden halt, you'll be able to keep your gun on the target. The maximum gun elevation is 20 degrees and gun depression is minus 13 degrees, which is pretty good. It takes about 5 seconds to alternate between these two limits. The turret is manually traversed, which takes roughly 31 seconds to complete a full rotation, which, although average for this tier, is still a little irritating. The gun sight is located right next to the weapon, which, if like me you use the realistic sight location setting, makes aiming a little easier. But because the gun is so stubby, you can't see it through the sight aperture. Next to the main gun is the coaxial machine gun, a 7.5mm MAC-31 with 2,400 rounds of ammunition stored in 150 round pan magazines, which mount vertically on the side of the weapon. The hull is armoured to 34mm thick all round, which will stop all machine gun bullets and even some types of cannon shell, but don't rely on it to save you from anything but the lowest velocity main guns. The roof of the turret is 25mm thick, and that of the hull is 22mm thick, which will keep out the rifle caliber bullets fired by most aircraft at this sort of tier, but the odd 12.7mm machine gun bullet or cannon round may get through. At the very front of the hull is the Hotchkiss badge, so your enemies know what kind of tank they're shooting at. Belowing it are 2 towing eyes, which, if you are unlucky enough to hit them, count for 15mm of additional armour. Behind the front glacis plate is the transmission, which is frontally mounted, meaning that there is a great big drive shaft running down the length of the fighting compartment. Behind the transmission sits the driver, who steers the vehicle using the usual tiller system. The reason why the Hotchkiss H-35 was so unwieldy off-road can also be explained here. The differential lacked a device that would make it a Cleveland differential, which had been patented by Renault and is more commonly known as the Cletrac differential. This system was first invented by the Cleveland Tractor Company in 1921 and essentially allows the vehicle to steer without losing power. Because Hotchkiss did not use this differential, it could respond unpredictably to direction changes, especially off-road. This problem was not helped by the rather weak brakes the tank possessed. Anyways, the drive sprockets are at the front due to the frontally mounted transmission. Also, fun fact, the H-35's gearbox was very stiff, meaning that it was very difficult for the driver to engage 5th gear. This meant that he rarely did so, meaning that the H-35 seldom pootled along at more than 20 km per hour, or 12.4 miles per hour, and when he did manage to engage 5th gear, because of the effort required, he was reluctant to shift down again. This further increased the danger the Hotchkiss H-35 posed to the infantry it was supposed to be supporting. The driver got in and out of the tank by means of a split hatch in the front. Because the top half hinged upwards, to open it was rather difficult. The driver had to push against the weight of a big 34mm thick slab of cast steel. Behind his seat, however, there was a small escape hatch. The driver saw the world through 3 tiny vision slits, one in front and one on each side. However, he could push open a small hatch to his front in order to improve visibility when not in combat. Not sure if those round plates on the sides are openable, but I'd imagine not. They're just there to make the vision slits easier to cut. The round thing to the left of the driver's position is the cover for the transmission lubrication filler. The mudguards are simple unarmoured steel panels, and that little UFO-looking thing on the left one is in fact the tank's horn. One thing the tank does appear to be missing, however, is any kind of headlights, so good luck driving at night, I guess. On the left side of the tank is the exhaust pipe, complete with muffler. The exhaust aperture faces forwards because French. I guess the tank can't really go fast enough for it to be a problem, but still, an exhaust pipe is supposed to face backwards. In the middle of the hull stands the commander. There is no turret basket, so he has to shuffle around when turning the turret, being careful not to trip up over the driveshaft housing. He does get a little leather sling to sit on when not in combat, however. On the right side, inside the hull, is the main ammunition stowage rack, containing 67 shells. There is an additional bunch of 9 shells sitting next to the driver, which I guess he can hand back to the commander if need be. On each side of the hull is another towing loop, from which things can be draped. These would be used if ever the tank flips itself over, I guess. Indeed, attached to the loop on the right is the towing chain. Tanks are heavy, they need chains to tow them. Mounted on brackets on the right side of the tank are the various paraphernalia that usually ship with the vehicle. You've got a shovel and a pickaxe for digging stuff, such as if the tank becomes bogged down, as well as a bent pipe thing. That device looks to actually be a kind of giant screwdriver, used to unscrew the various bolts holding the tank together. My guess is that it would be used most frequently to, say, remove track links, replace road wheels, or remove the engine cover so that the power plant can be lifted out. Due to the need of this tank for frequent engine overhauls, this last feature would certainly come in handy. Now some of you might be thinking, you know, Circus Lot, that thing looks an awful lot like a starter handle if you ask me. And indeed I thought so too at first. However, upon further inspection, it seems to be more akin to an external hex socket screwdriver, which matches up with many of the hex bolts you can see around the tank. Besides, I can't find any kind of hole into which this tool could be inserted, so it's most likely not a starter handle. Now sit down. The suspension consists of 3 bogies on each side, utilising a simple scissor-type system, being hinged at the base in the centre, the rubber-rimmed road wheel attached to the corner of the bell crank. The tank's weight is supported by horizontal coil springs at the top of each scissor, which compress when the vehicle moves over an obstacle. There are 2 rubber-rimmed returner rollers on each side. To keep the tracks tensioned, the rear rubber-rimmed idler wheels are mounted on heavy springs. These keep the tracks tensioned automatically, a feature no doubt appreciated by the crews. In fact, those 2 nodule-looking things at the back are, I believe, the mountings for the idler springs. Inside the engine compartment, separated from the crew compartment by a firewall, are all the gubbins that make the tank go. The engine is offset to the left to allow space for the radiator and fuel tank on the right. Directly above the engine is a large hatch through which the driver, who also acted as the tank's engineer, could perform maintenance. To remove the engine, however, the entire upper rear section of the hull would need to be taken off. The engine deck has two sets of ventilation louvres, the larger one for the engine and the smaller for the radiator. That little rectangular panel covers the fuel and oil fillers. On the back is a mounting for a single spare road wheel and the roll of camouflage tarpaulin. Were the tank fitted with a tail skid, as this one is not, this would not only aid in trench crossing capability, it would also provide space for more equipment to be stored. Underneath there are two more towing loops. On the rear fenders are the convoy lights, because although this tank lacks headlights, you can't have anyone bumping into the back of you, can you? As it stands, the Hotchkiss H-35 seems to have a serious dearth of equipment most tankers would consider essential for the maintaining of the vehicle in combat. Sure, you've got your unditching tools and your giant screwdriver, as well as a spare wheel, some tow chains and a bit of tarp, but where's your toolbox? Where are the stowage bins? Where's this tank man supposed to store all his crap? No bolt cutters, no fuel cans, no spare track links, not even a jack. Good God, there isn't even a tank bar. What are you supposed to pry damaged bits of the tank off with? There's a reason why every photograph of a Sherman shows it festooned with various bits of paraphernalia. That's what's required to keep a big piece of equipment, i.e. a tank, running, while being driven through rivers, waist-deep mud, across shell-cratered fields, through buildings and on cobbled French streets, all the while being rained on, shot at, shelled and lived in by a bunch of big burly unwashed tank men. So France, drape more crap on your tanks. Anyways, in addition to the serious lack of accessories, the Hotchkiss H-35 also has some other serious issues. It has a crew of only 2, so if one gets killed, then boom, you're out of the match. Why there is a crew replenishment option, I have no idea. If your crew needs replenishing, you're already out of the game. The gun is a joke. It's a literal joke. Knock knock. Who's there? French gun. Hee hee. Get it? Yeah, what do you know? Anyways, it's tiny, 37mm, super low velocity at 600 meters per second with APCR ammunition. It has a slow rate of fire and can just barely penetrate the front of a Panzer II at point blank range. God help you if you come across a T-70. In fact, guess what type of gun it is? That's right, it's the Puteaux, same as that mounted on the Renault FT-17 from the last war. In addition to the crap gun, the tank it's mounted in is little better. The turret turns slow, the tank turns slower, it moves slow, it climbs obstacles slowly, it accelerates slow, it reverses slow, everything about it is slow. Yes, there are slower tanks out there, but this one, it just really feels sluggish. You know what I mean? And then there's the armour. This tank is one of the most well-armoured vehicles at these low tiers. You know what that means? It means that it is just thick enough to activate the fuses on any APHE shells fired at it, while still being thin enough to let everything but a wet paper aeroplane straight through. Yes, you're more likely to get a lucky ricochet than, say, a ha-go, but since when has anyone but every other player you encounter been lucky? Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, this tank sounds like a piece of crap, and you'd be right. And yet, despite everything I've said, I actually quite like this tank. Why? Well, let's find out. Right, so the first battle here is in Poland. You'll know how the French fought in Poland, and there's a Charlie B-1 Bis with us. So we have been upped here just a smidge, but hopefully we won't encounter anything of that sort on the opposite team. Nothing down that street there. You've got to be ever vigilant in this tank, because your armour will not save you. Accidentally knocked over the gazebo there, and there are tracks heading in this direction. We're going to follow them, see what's going on. And just looking at... oh no, there's a Panzer foot, and he shoots me. He gets off the first shot. As you can see, the heat shell goes straight through the armour and through the commander. Next up, we're the Dried River or whatever it's called. There's something in the sea cap, and so we're gonna flank round ever so sneaky like, and we're gonna shoot at him. And oh, there's one of those funny amphibious tank things, an LVT. And he's got his turret crew already knocked out, but our shots just aren't doing enough damage. We're killing the odd crew member, but he gets his crew back in time. So he puts a shot straight through the front of the turret. So there you go. Next up, we're here in the snow. Let's say it's Norway. It's not Norway, but let's just say it is, because that's one of the places where Hotchkiss H-35s fought. And yes, this is a 35, but oh well. And there's a Panzer II. And because of the incredibly low velocity of these shells, we can loop them over that little hill. And I'm thinking, well, our armor's impervious to a 20mm cannon. No, it's not. He goes through the turret ring. That's one of the many weaknesses of the front of the H-35. There you see, I don't even think that was an APCR shell. And so finally, here we are on one that actually I managed to achieve something other than being killed very quickly by tanks that ought not to be able to kill things so quickly. So we're gonna go drive towards A. I'm thinking that's a good place to go towards, so that's where we're gonna go. Being passed by all the much faster, better vehicles, including that Staghound anti-aircraft thing. And you can just see how it struggles to get up even the slightest of hills. 12, 10, 8, 10 kilometers per hour, that's about 8 miles per hour. Ever so slowly. And we're cresting the ridge. Here we go. And we made it. There you can see the suspension going. The bell crank scissor suspension, whatever's. And we're up to our top speed. 27 kilometers per hour. It's just slow, isn't it? So we're gonna go to the right of the capture point, and hopefully catch the enemy with their trousers down as they're capping it. So we're gonna flank round behind it. And there's a lot of fighting going on in there, it seems like. Our team is capturing A. But oh no, they've stopped capturing. That means there's dirty work afoot. So we're going to have to go and break it up, so to speak. I think you can hear some of the gunfire already. I can't actually hear anything because when recording the narration you can't hear what's going on in the video, which is annoying, but it'll have to do. Break through this mighty fence as if it wasn't even there. Now aim for this gap and break it down as well. It's an Italian town, so we don't need to worry about collateral damage. And I'm gonna go mosey on through these houses. It's more sneaky than going along the road, don't you know? And looking around, doesn't seem to be anything down there. And there's a friendly Panzer 35. He's chugging along. But we're going to cross the road and go down this alleyway. If you ever saw the Italian job, we're doing exactly what that Land Rover did. Going down the sneaky route. Break down this fence. I can hear explosions. I can see tracer fire. Yep, so there's something definitely going on the other side of this fence. So I'm going to head towards this direction. But oh wait, no, it's over there. Ah. Oh, I just saw a shot. Just saw that. I'm going to reverse that. That Panzer 35 is going to go and investigate. We're going to hang back, see what we can see. But there doesn't appear to be anything there anymore, so we're going to go through our intended fence. There's another gunshot. And by the time we get there, everything's already dead. Oh well. Happens a lot in this tank. You get anywhere where you're supposed to be going, too late to be doing what you're supposed to be doing when you get there. It's annoying, but that's what happens with such a slow vehicle. So, we're going to go towards B now, because that is currently under assault by the enemy. Sort of. We've captured it now. Oh well, might as well follow my regular patrol route. Keeping an eye out, looking all around. I heard a gunshot somewhere. It's probably just our team being silly. Nope, there's definitely shots going out from over there. Turn around. What are they shooting at? Go and investigate. However, as it turned out, they were just mucking about like a bunch of silly people. Mucking around. There's time and a place. It isn't now. But oh no! Capture point B is currently being captured by the enemy. So we're going to have to scurry on over there as quickly as we can. By which I mean 27 kilometers per hour. You could probably run faster than that. Keeping an eye out on all the roads. He seems to be down there in the park. Taking a look down this boulevard. Looking to our left. Is there anything down there? Well, looking through the binoculars, there's just a couple of tank husks. But oh, there's something down there. I could just about see it. He's shooting. I fire off a shot, but it misses as I'm breaking through the fence. And, well, where's he gone? He's disappeared. Well, we're going to have to go and see where he's gone. So we're moving up, keeping an eye on that corner. He's not there anymore. Well, something's being shot at, but that's just a bush. And there he is! There he is, I can see him. I fire a shot, it goes into his radiator and sets him on fire. Second shot misses, because I can't really see him, he's in all the smoke. He puts out the fire, my third shot hits the space armor on the side of the turret. So that goes to show that the A-13's turret space armor does count for something. I switched to APCR after that last shot because I'm getting annoyed. Next shot goes through the cupola because I forget to account for the bullet drop-off. Next one goes into the coaxial machine gun. And then finally, we put one through the driver's hatch and we knock out the rest of the crew. So there you have it, a kill with the H-35. It can be done, see? And just moving up, see if there's anything else there. But then I noticed that A's been captured, so, well, I don't want to be sitting around in the capture point for the rest of the battle, so I'm going to go and see what's going on in A. Put a stop to any of this tomfoolery that the red team is up to. Can't be having with the tomfoolery. That's the wrong kind of foolery, don't you know? So we're chugging along up this little hillock. And we're going to bust through this fence. Oh no, somebody already has. Alright, we're going to go through the gap that he's made. And looking up ahead... Oh, there's something shooting over there. What is that? What is he shooting at? Oh, I missed the first shot. Next shot. Oh no, it's a Char B1 bis. There's no way I'm getting through that thing. So we're hosing him down with a machine gun to obscure his vision. He can't see us, so he misses his few shots. And so we're going to flank around. We're going to hit him in that little soft spot, in the engine grill. Because I know that's where the armour is weakest. And so we're gonna cut through these gardens, or courtyards, or whatever they call them. Bust down the fence. Crash through this other fence. Whoa. Dramatic. I'm gonna knock down this post. And taking a look down there. I can't see him, just the dead good guy. But I think that's too close. I want to come out behind him if at all possible. And I think he's still in the same position. But because this tank is so slow, he has changed his position by the time I get there. So I'm thinking, well, he must have gone back towards A. So I'm looking back. Somebody's shooting at him, I think. He's not there. Where is he? Oh, crap, there he is. And I just noticed, but nah. He fires his big old 75mm howitzer. And it goes straight into the side of the tank and kills everybody. So, there you have it. The Hotchkiss H-35. It's... let's face it, it's crap. It's one of the worst tanks in the game, to be perfectly honest. And yet I still quite like it. I think it's kind of fun. Most people won't think so. They say, hey, you can't have a tank this bad as the first tank that people who are new joining the game are going to play, because they just won't want to play it. Well, to them I say, well, it's good, dump them in the deep end. Make men out of them. Harden them up for the trials that are to come. It doesn't get much easier from here. I mean, yeah, you get more capable guns and more capable tanks, but still, you got to be able to play them well, and you learn that by playing the terrible tanks at this tier. And if you can get good in the H-35, well, you've got it made for the rest of the game. Anyway, so yes, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, hey, why not press that subscriber button? I could always do with more subscribers, don't you know? And hopefully you'll join us for the next one, where we'll be taking a little look at the pea shooters. Yes, I know I've already done a video about the P26 pea shooters, but that was a terrible video made many years ago. That was crap and in the old format, so I'm going to do one in the new format where I actually talk about interesting things such as history and that and whatnot, don't you know? So yes, hopefully you'll join us for that one. And if you want to see a bonus video about any vehicles that you are interested in that aren't in the order that I have chosen for this video series, then why not say that as well? The next bonus video will be on the Shinhoto Chi-Ha, because I've already had a request for that, but you can put your comment in the comment section and say which vehicle you'd want a bonus video about next time. So yeah, thank you very much for watching again, and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye.